On first down, they hand off to Marlon Mack. Huge hole, 50-yard line. He's at the 40, still going near sideline. He's at the 10. He's at the 5, and he will score. Touchdown, Marlon Mack. Touchdown, I-N-D-Y. And again, it's picked off. It's Darius Leonard. Leonard with a second INT, and he's streaking down the near sideline. He's at the 40. He's at the 30. He's at the 20. He's going to go. A pick six for the Maniac. Kenny Moore gets to Deshaun Watson. That's a sack for Kenny Moore. Kenny has a pick and now a sack in the game.
Horseshoe is back, baby. The horseshoe is back.
Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Bring the Juice podcast. I'm your co-host, Cody Felger, as always. Joining me, Derek Larger. Derek, the Colts just made a move, and a pretty decent, significant move here. What are your initial first reactions? How are you doing? How are you feeling about this move?
Well, you recognize the name immediately. You see Xavier Rhodes. You immediately think, wow, the 2017 All-Pro corner who was widely regarded as one of the top maybe 3 defensive backs in all of the NFL. I mean, just a few short years ago, this guy was at the top of the NFL. And obviously, we're going to break down a little bit more of why he's here with the Colts and things like that. But initial first impressions, this definitely feels like a good move to me, and we'll obviously explain why.
Yeah, for sure. And you got into it, Derek. We'll explain why we think it's, the positives of this move. There's also some negatives that come along with this move because it's not a multi-year deal. It's only a 1-year deal. I believe you said somewhere around $5 million or so.
Yep.
So a couple $1 million less than Pierre Desir, which is significant. And he's the guy, man, that I think we can start off here by kind of looking a little bit about him. So he's a guy you mentioned. He was actually a guy that the Colts could have potentially taken back in that 2013 draft, and they opted to take, obviously, Bjorn Werner, draft bust in a major way, and Rhodes obviously turned out to be an all-pro player, very good player for the Vikings for a lot of years. But last year was kind of a rough year for him. He was dealt with the injury bug a lot, really injury-plagued season. And he's a guy that you mentioned that it seemed like the Vikings wanted to keep him, but he carried a $12.9 million cap hit. He was under contract through 2022, so they decided to cut ties with him. They let him be a free agent, and then he, about a week after the Colts released Pierre Desir, they signed another veteran, 29-year corner Xavier Rhodes. Derek, what does this move mean? What are some, what is the point of the Colts making this move for a guy who, a couple of years ago he was really good, but the last couple of years he's just been injured and he hasn't been to that all-pro level. What do you think that was going through the Colts' mind and Chris Ballard's mind in making this move?
Well, definitely. I saw somebody mention how Chris Ballard is righting wrongs, basically, of what Ryan Grigson did. Obviously taking Vernon over Rhodes. So he's just bringing a guy back that we should have gotten back several years ago. So this kind of move, it goes back to the argument that we made of Chris Ballard getting those big name free agents, right? Even though Xavier Rhodes is not necessarily a top corner right now, the name just speaks volumes. You hear that name and you just think the potential and what this guy is able to do. He is a veteran. And we have said for, a long time, this Colts secondary is very, very young. Obviously, with Malik Hooker only being in his 3rd season, Kahari Willis being a rookie last year, Rocky Sin being a rookie last year, Kenny Moore only being in the NFL for a few years. This is a very young secondary. And don't get me wrong, Pierre Desir was definitely a guy that you had to look at, and you obviously saw his age, but Pierre Desir was not at a caliber of a Xavier Rhodes. Like you mentioned earlier, Cody, when we were off the air, Xavier Rhodes has that pedigree. We knew what he had. He may never get back to that form again, but if we can tap into that a little bit, if he can stay healthy and be even half the corner that he was before, this is certainly a move that definitely piques your interest. And we mentioned it with the money. 1 year, $5 million. That's it. It's easy. It's an easy decision to take a big name, what was once one of the best corners in the league, bring him in, bring him a fresh start, and say, go out and prove it to me. If you do great this next year, then we'll re-sign you. We'll keep you around for a couple more years. If you don't do well, then we're gonna move on from you. It's as simple as that. And what was the point I was just about to make? Yeah, I mentioned it to you right before we went on air that when Rhodes was going through this free agency process, the Vikings were actually trying to re-sign him, trying to give him a little bit extra money than what the Colts were willing to give him. But apparently, like, the relationship there just wasn't fixable. And he said he just wanted to get a fresh start and a fresh new area, someplace where he can call home. And I mean, he certainly felt that, the Colts being in that area definitely helps. And one thing I'm sure you're going to bring up here soon is, the defensive backs coach for Indianapolis probably certainly played a role in that as well.
Yeah, huge connection there, Derek. So Xavier Rhodes was actually so the Colts' current cornerback coach, Jonathan Gannon, and defensive backs coach Alan Williams, they were both on staff with the Vikings when Xavier Rhodes was there the last few years. So there's obviously that connection. One thing, Derek, that you mentioned that I wanted to double back on here, you look at the difference between Pierre Desir and Xavier Rhodes, same age, 29 years old, both kind of had down injury-plagued seasons this last year. But the thing that stands out to me is, the pedigree, first off, which we talked about. Xavier Rhodes was an All-Pro in 2017. But also it goes back to what Chris Ballard was talking about in his press conference at the end of the 2019 season. He said, specifically, I remember he said, we lost veteran leadership. After we went that 5-2 record, we really became, I think he labeled it as a momentum team. So basically, they weren't a team, like, if they're really hot, they're hot, and if they're really low, they're low. And we saw that the back half of the season. The Colts could not finish games. There was all this stuff, and they went on a huge losing streak. I mean, they went from 5-2 to 7-9. So obviously something didn't go right there. And he mentioned, man, that veteran presence. There wasn't enough guys. He called it friction. There wasn't enough friction in that locker room. And I think signing a guy like Rhodes, even if he's not the All-Pro player he was in 2017, I think it's just something where, similar to kind of what Andrew and I talked last night about the Sheldon Day signing. One thing that was interesting about Sheldon Day and DeForest Buckner here is there are two guys who have done it. There are two guys that know what it takes to win. And I think that sends a message to your locker room that we want to be about winning, right? We don't want to be about ourselves. We want to be about the team. And these guys, we're bringing in guys now that have been there. Xavier Rhodes has been in an NFC champion. He's been in some big moments as well.
Yeah.
But it's something, man, where I think it's sending a message to your locker room that we're bringing in guys who know what it takes to win and win at the next level. And I think that speaks volumes to kind of what Chris Ballard is wanting to do. He's brought in some veteran guys now. He brought in Justin Houston last year. I don't know if you would label those two guys, Sheldon Day and DeForest Buckner, as veterans, but they're guys that have played in the big moments.
Yep.
And, you just bring in some of those guys, and obviously you bring in Xavier Rhodes. Now you bring in some veteran guys who have done it. So like you mentioned, a very young secondary, Kenny Moore, Rocky Sin, Marvell Tell, Quincy Wilson, they're all going into their either second, third, or fourth year. So they're all very young players in a lot of ways. And so, maybe it's something where, if you have a guy that's kind of been struggling, hasn't really been living up to potential, man, these are some of the guys that can hold them accountable. Right. We saw that with Mike Mitchell and Quincy Wilson. When Quincy Wilson had somebody holding him accountable and teaching him how to be a pro, he was really good. And then when Mike Mitchell was gone last year, Quincy Wilson was kind of, he started off decent, but then what happened? He lost focus. He didn't really have anybody to hold him accountable. and he reverted back to 2017 Quincy Wilson. That's just what happened. And I just think it speaks volumes, Derek, to what Chris Ballard is trying to do. And also, you mentioned the potential, man. There could be a potential. Xavier Rhodes is 29, going to be 30 here in a couple months. What if he reverts back? What if he stays healthy? What if he has a Justin Houston type of year?
Yeah.
I mean, man, your defense is going to be so good. Your defense is
yeah.
going to be so much better. And I think it's something where you look at the ceilings of Pierre Desir and you look at the ceilings of a guy like him, a guy like Xavier Rhodes, and it's not even comparable. I mean, it's really not. You know, the best you could get from Pierre Desir, we've already seen it.
Yeah.
I mean, he hit his ceiling, I feel like.
Yeah.
Xavier Rhodes, his ceiling is all pro. And you got him cheaper also, which I think is huge. And so, and also he's on a 1-year deal. If it doesn't work out, similar to, you know, some of the other players the Colts have brought in, doesn't work out with Phillip Rivers, you can let him go next year. Doesn't work out with Xavier Rhodes, you can let him go next year.
Yeah.
But these are moves that I think, Derek, for me, signal we want to win now. We feel like we have a talented enough roster. We want to win now, and we think we can win now. What does this speak, I guess, from Chris Ballard's standpoint to you? What does this send to the fans, to the people listening to this podcast, to the Colts fans who aren't listening to this podcast, to all of Colts Nation? What message does this send to him? And also, what message does this send to the Colts locker room?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. What does this send to everyone? I mean, this really does go to show you that we're all in. I mean, Ballard has always preached it. It's a matter of keeping guys accountable, right? You look at the personalities of guys like a DeForest Buckner, of a Phillip Rivers, of a Xavier Rhodes. DeForest Buckner, maybe not so much, but DeForest Buckner's been on that biggest stage just last year. He knows what it's like. And Phillip Rivers, Xavier Rhodes, guys that are actually willing to make guys accountable. That's what you need. And a locker room full of guys who are still young, who are still learning, and they'll get on them. They're not gonna fight with them, but they're gonna get on them and make sure that guys that are, you know, guys like Quincy Wilson or Rocky Sin that might have something happen, you know, they can preach to them about something and they'll listen because they know Phillip Rivers and a Xavier Rhodes have been there before and they know it and they know how they operate. And I mean, it just sends the Colts Nation that, you know, this team is ready and all in. And I mean, the players are loving these things too. I know Kenny Moore was not very happy with Pierre Desir leaving, obviously, because, you know, that's his best friend, guy that he's known for several years now. You get to be friends with guys in the locker room that you work side by side with every year. But even today, Kenny Moore posted a tweet that said Rhodes closed. That was really funny. Darius Fountain has been saying that our training camp this year is going to be lit. It certainly sounds like he's ready for the competition that he's going to get from some of these guys. So, I mean, I'm already seeing the message that this is displaying amongst the locker room, especially for that defense and for some of these young guys on the offense, that there's no time to mess around now. It's time to get to work. It's time to get ready for a chance to run for a Super Bowl now before we start getting into the potential of getting a new quarterback. So, I mean, I love the message that Chris Ballard is trying to send to the locker room, that this team needs to start performing and being held accountable. And he's showing us fans for the first time in 3 years since we've had this man that he's willing to go longer distances to reach guys who he feels is going to help. And this defense right now, if DeForest Buckner is anything like we expect him to be, and with Xavier Rhodes, if he can even be half of what most people think he can be, kind of have a close similar to what Justin Houston had for his season, my Lord, dude, this is a top 10 defense up and down the board, man.
It is. One thing you mentioned, Derek, which I think is interesting, is that Chris Ballard has really changed his entire strategy this offseason. He knew at the end of I remember he said, I'll quote him here. He said, "I'm pissed, but I'm not discouraged. And I think he knows he's just a few pieces away from the Colts being a contender. I mean, my gosh, you look at some of those games that the Colts lost. I mean, some of them were, one-score games. Most of them were one-score games. And so, if you add a Phillip Rivers, you added a fourth, you add some good players on top of your already young, good core, I think Chris Ballard is like, we're ready to go and ready to go now. And if it does blow up in my face, I still have some young guys. I still have the draft. I still have a lot of things going for me. Even if it doesn't work out this year, if we're not a Super Bowl champion at the end of the 2020 season, we still have a lot of guys that we like there. And another thing, Derek, I'm kind of thinking now, man. I've been in a locker room before, a football locker room. You just think of this. So if you're a young player, say you're one of those Colts young cornerbacks there, and last year things aren't going super well, you're feeling discouraged, you're feeling bummed, you're like, man, we just can't win a game. I feel like we started off well. I don't know what's been happening, and you have another guy who's, one of your teammates who's trying to lift you up. But this teammate is just as young as you are. He doesn't really have much experience outside of this. He's saying, man, we'll be okay. We'll be all right. I mean, I feel like there's just such a difference. And then you factor in, say it happens again this year, something goes wrong, the Colts lose a couple games. Then you have a Xavier Rhodes who has been there, who is an All-Pro, who has done it before. I think that just is like, okay, we can follow this guy. This guy knows what he's talking about. No offense to any of the Colts corners, but like none of those guys really have the pedigree that a Xavier Rhodes has. I mean, they're young. They haven't had that experience yet. And so I just think it's a huge, huge thing for all levels. I mean, you look at this Colts defense now, man, and they have some guys. They have some dogs now. They have who can be game-changing. And it's super exciting, man. It's super exciting because you see the potential there. If it all does pan out, it's like you mentioned, man, this Colts defense could be a top 10 defense. And if Phillip Rivers works out, man, I mean, the sky's the limit for this team. And the cool thing is here, I feel like we always knew kind of what the Colts ceiling was going to be last year. I always said they'll probably be, 8-8, 9-7, 7-9, around there. Especially with Jacoby Brissett as quarterback. But, man, for the first time, I really have no clue what the Colts are going to do. I really have no idea what's going to happen, and that's exciting and scary and all those things wrapped up into one. But, man, it's just so cool because now Chris Ballard is saying, I'm going to change my philosophy. I believe you can buy a locker. I believe you can't buy a locker room, but I know that there's talent outside of our locker room, outside of the draft. And it's cool, man. I'm really excited. I think Xavier Rhodes is a pretty decent signing. What grade, Derek, would you give this signing? I'm trying to figure out what grade. I was thinking about it earlier. I really didn't know what grade. I think I have an idea now, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts on the grade you'd give the Xavier Rhodes signing.
Yeah, I'm giving this a solid B plus. I mean, just simply off of the fact that, like you mentioned, it's a good player that is looking for a fresh start to try and reestablish whatever career he had before, and is trying to make a new name for himself in a new place. 29 years old. I know he won't be around for very long, but you can keep that around for a few years if he stays healthy. And you got him for $5 million. You got a corner whose ceiling is an All-Pro to be for $5 million on a 1-year deal. That is borderline an A. It's borderline an A because, like we mentioned, it's less money than what they would have to pay for Desir if Desir was still there. And like you mentioned, with Xavier Rhodes, who's had that experience, the only guy on the defense that can escape the age argument for his age is Darius Leonard. He's the only one that can escape that age because Darius Leonard is by far the best defensive player on our team, quite possibly the best player on our team. He can escape that age aspect because he's the leader of the defense and one of the leaders of the team. But with Xavier Rhodes, like you mentioned, when you're in a locker room, you don't always want to listen to the guy that's as young as you or younger than you when they're trying to tell you what to do, but you listen to a guy like Xavier Rhodes who has that experience. Again, just the move makes sense with the defensive back coach knowing Xavier Rhodes personally. It just seems like a good environment for Rhodes to get behind, because Rhodes, obviously, when you're trying to find a new home and you're trying to reestablish your career, you want to feel in an environment that brings out the best in you. And I believe this Colts locker room is one of the best places in football to have that happen, to be in that locker room, feel that brotherhood that is unlike a lot of other teams. And I just feel that will give Rhodes an extra motivation. So yeah, I'm giving this a solid B+ for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. Man, I'm probably gonna go. So I was torn between a B- and a B, so I'm probably gonna go like right in between there. Probably lean more towards a B than a B- because, like you mentioned, it's a 1-year deal. We're getting him relatively cheap, and there is that potential that he could be an All-Pro player. He has that kind of ceiling. So I'm gonna go probably, if I had to give it a percent, probably an 85, 86%. Now that I think about it a little bit more, especially considering, you're not really investing that much into Xavier Rhodes. He's a guy, man, that he has that potential, but if it doesn't work out, it's okay. Like, no harm, no foul. You're only paying him $5 million. I mean, it's peanuts in the NFL. I mean, I'd take $5 million in a heartbeat, but it's nothing in the NFL. And so I'm totally okay with this move. I think, I think it also could help you with the draft, and I just, of course, right after I dropped my mock draft, mocking a corner to the Colts at 34, the Colts go and sign Xavier Rhodes. So, maybe it changes that. I don't know, but it's certainly something that was a position I felt like was the weakness, especially with releasing Desir last week. And now I feel like maybe it could be a strength. Maybe it could, if Xavier Rhodes works out. If Rocky Sin continues to develop, Marvell Tell continues to develop, if Quincy Wilson somehow bounces back, Kenny Moore, obviously the best slot corner in the league. If it all works out, the Colts could have a really pretty solid trio of corners there and maybe some good depth behind that. But yeah, I'll probably give it a B for me as well. Derek, do you have anything else here on the Xavier Rhodes move before we wrap this podcast up?
It's just another classic Ballard signing. This just feels, again, it just fits his MO. It's just not very often that you see him sign a guy like this that has a name like Xavier Rhodes does. So listen, Colts fans, I know it may not be the flashiest move. It might not even work out. Who knows? But just ignore last season for a second. Let's just kind of think about what could potentially happen. And if it doesn't work out, no harm done. It didn't hurt us much. But man, if this does work out, I'm super excited.
Chris Ballard. Look at Chris Ballard, man. He's making up for lots of draft mistakes by previous management. So shout out to Chris Ballard signing Xavier Rhodes. We'll see how it plays out. But on the surface here, it seems like potentially a good move. So I think that does it for this podcast. Thank you guys for listening as always. And as always, go Colts.